Welcome, everyone. My name is John Shelby, and it's my pleasure to be your host throughout CORT. I'm also a religious recovery consultant and a registered professional counselor. Some of you have been curious about the land treaty acknowledgement that I offer as a Canadian at the start of each day of CORT. The acknowledging of the traditional territory is a protocol that has been practiced by Aboriginal people for generations. It is a means of showing respect for the nation that has lived in a given region since long before the arrival of European settlers. Today, I gratefully acknowledge that the land upon which I live, learn, and play is located in the unceded territory of the Sioux people in what is now known as the Okanagan Valley of British Columbia, Canada. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for. I'm very pleased to announce our keynote speaker for tonight, Janet Heimlich. She's an award-winning journalist and author, and her book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment, is the first book to fully examine the issue of child abuse and neglect enabled by religious belief. In 2012, she founded the Child Friendly Faith Project, whose mission is to share knowledge and build community around the issue of religious child maltreatment. What an important project. Tonight, Janet will be addressing the important topic of how to end religious child abuse and neglect. Welcome, Janet Heimlich.
Janice, thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for your interest and caring about this topic. Yes, my focus and research has been on how we can better protect children, but my nonprofit also supports survivors. So very often when I'm talking about this topic, I'm looking at influences, negative religious influences on children, but we also are always engaging with adults who are survivors. And so I'll be talking about how we can serve that group as well. So I think I'm going to start by sharing just make sure this works here. Getting to the next slide. Here we are. So I coined this term, religious child maltreatment, and I know that was not in the title of this talk because most people know maltreatment as abuse and neglect, but that's what maltreatment is. And I think it's important to always bring awareness to the fact that neglect is actually a much larger group of victims. So and religion plays into those forms of maltreatment as well. So when we're defining RCM, this is how I've defined it. Child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious belief, practice, or doctrine. Perpetrators are very often parents, which is the case in non-religious forms of maltreatment, just because parents are the ones that are spending more time with children. But perpetrators can be religious leaders, siblings, Bible study teachers, it really runs the gamut. But when we're talking about parents, very often the folks that are perpetrating these forms of maltreatment are what cult experts call middle managers. And you'll understand a little bit more about how that plays in later in my talk. But they are oftentimes caught in the middle between their instincts and what they feel is best for their children and serving them their individual needs, and also trying to appease religious leadership. So in that sense, parents who are perpetrators can also be victims. They're ideologically driven sometimes to abuse and neglect. Sometimes they will use religious messaging as a way to control, abuse, or harm children. Very often the motivation is to protect the image of a religious group or leader or a religion. We're going to look at some examples so you can get a better idea of what these cases entail. Although I'm sure that if some of you are survivors, you will have stories of your own. And in the Q&A, I encourage anyone that wants to enlighten the group by sharing any kind of personal experience you'd like. If you're comfortable with that, to please do. But here are a few. I could go on and on and on with the examples, but here are a few that we can talk about. Religious medical neglect is one that tends to be very high profile because very often when it's covered in the media, it's after a child has died. And we've been very involved, my nonprofit has been very involved in trying to change the laws of one state, that is Idaho, where more children die of religious medical neglect than any other state due to the lax laws there that allow that to happen. But going back to the heyday of the Christian Science Church, you had many children who were killed in the name of faith by denying them life-saving medical care. And this also related to, as you'll see in a minute from this quote by Carolyn Fraser, it isn't just permanent disability, suffering, disease, and death. It's also emotional abuse. And very often, emotional maltreatment plays into these cases, and that's something that's important to remember. Well, Caroline Fraser, as a child growing up in the Christian Science Church, had a very queasy stomach, and she threw up in car rides almost all the time. Well, in the Christian Science Church, any kind of illness is blamed on one's mind. There's something wrong about the mind and not the body. So this is how she described one incident when she was thinking back on it. Car sickness was mortal mind. Throwing up was mortal mind. I waited for God to fill up the world like the air in a balloon, but the air in the car just got worse and worse. Then I threw up, a horrible explosion of error, the vomit snaking down my Sunday dress and the seat of the car. Now I was error. Error was in me. Error was me. My father thought so too. This is a gentleman on the left. His name is Brian Brzee, and he grew up in the Mormon church. He's like fifth generation. His son, Samuel, when he was 14, took his own life based on, from what the dad could piece together in reading what his child had written online. Based on extreme bullying due to perceptions that Samuel was gay. And the Mormon Church is a very homophobic institution. But in addition to that form of emotional abuse, they also force children to go through what are called worthiness interviews, where a child would sit alone with a bishop. Only recently have they allowed parents in. And the bishop would then ask all kinds of very inappropriate, personal, sexual questions, even children as young as 8 years old. Samuel went through that. Brian went through that. And it was only until after Samuel died that Brian really started to look at the teachings and understanding how harmful they are. When it comes to religious sexual abuse, there have been times where a certain religion's ideology is designed to foster, to lead to adult child sex. We'll look at some examples of that. But more often, in a religious context, the damaging issues are a poor response to sexual abuse. I have a quote here from Brent Jeffs. His book, Lost Boy, looks at what he suffered, a victim of sexual abuse, where the perpetrator was the head of that organization. His name is Warren Jeffs, who's currently serving a life sentence in prison for having raped 2 girls during a marriage ritual. One was as young as 12. But he ended up raping a number of children. And Brent Jeffs, his nephew, was one of them. And you can see again how the religious ideologies combine with the sexual abuse itself to add trauma to trauma. I felt like I must have been a bad person for this to have happened to me, like it was some kind of punishment. I'd been told by Warren Jeffs that it was what God wanted. So I must have done something terrible. Why would God do that to a good boy? I felt like it was all my fault, that I should have done something to stop it. I felt filthy and disgusting and repulsive. I couldn't even explain it to myself, let alone tell an adult he had so much power in the church. And one ideology that I point to as being toxic for children is the belief that religious leaders are superhuman. I don't have time to go into that now, but that, along with a few other ideologies, are especially toxic when it comes to enabling child abuse and neglect. When we talk about justifying it, I mean, there are just all kinds of ways that people, whether they're a victim trying to dismiss it, or a perpetrator trying to hide it, or a religious leader trying to silence a child. We see all kinds of different ways that people will pull out of the religious bucket to justify what they've perpetrated. The one that I'm going to talk about next is this idea of children being resurrected. There have been cases where parents have killed their child or allowed them to die from neglect, partly because they believe that the kid would be resurrected and actually, happier. And this gentleman here, he used to be a lawmaker, a senator in the state of Idaho that I mentioned before. And this is how he justified all the children that were dying in that state. Those children that have gone, they're probably where that we're all trying to get. They're there. They've got it made. If we can just live a righteous life, one day we'll be with them again. So sort of gaslighting the entire electorate. I thought it was important when I was writing Breaking the Will to dig into how we define or identify harmful religious environments for children. Now, I know there are some that feel like any kind of religious environment is toxic for kids. I don't know if the data really backs that up, but there are certain warning signs that I think are critical to look at. I ended up determining that cases tend to happen in what I call religious authoritarian cultures. And there are three characteristics that these cultures have. A rigid social hierarchy, so where religious leaders are much more powerful than everyone else, and men have a lot more power, children are basically furniture, or I should say, considered as owned property. Very fear-based and punitive, and that applies to adults as well. But in the home, you'll see more authoritarian parenting. And also, they are socially separatist. Even if they are located in an urban environment, they will have some kind of separation between their members and everybody else. And these kinds of ideas are implanted in people, since birth, that teach them to fear or look down upon outsiders. Here are some of the things that you'll see happen in religious authoritarian cultures. The needs of the collective take priority over anyone's individual needs, including children. Again, as I talked about before, parents fall into this middle manager trap. So when that happens, children have lost their chief protectors and are very vulnerable. Authoritarian parenting, including physical discipline, is common in the home. We see kids that are considered to be non-compliant, disobedient, evil, having to undergo all kinds of punishment. Some of it that is justified as saving their soul. including exorcism, conversion therapy for LGBTQ kids, beatings based on beliefs about the Bible, promoting corporal punishment, and excommunication. And finally, cases don't get reported or are delayed due to that social separatism. And I want to add, too, that sometimes because of the oppressive nature of these organizations and communities, if punishment is delivered to the parent, that can also be really detrimental to the child, especially, say, if a loved one is excommunicated. And due to the fact that there is that resistance to reporting cases, very often, if they are acknowledged, they'll be overseen internally and usually not by women and not by people who have experience in these matters. I'm going to breeze through a few current cases. This one is a pretty recent one in terms of the arrest made, although the abuse is going on for a long time. And, these are so common that when I was putting the slideshow together, I mean, I literally just replaced the mug shot that you see here that had been another couple, just replaced them with this couple here. They have been charged with more than 100 felony charges relating to all forms of abuse of children at their girls' home called the Circle of Hope Girls' School. And on their website, they talked about helping young ladies who are destroying their lives through poor choices and behavior. So oftentimes they're, call it tough lover, whatever type of label you want to give it. They feel justified in abusing children because they're somehow correcting them for the better, having them, live a more righteous life or whatever they consider to be, according whatever their faith is, to be, deemed by deity or Jesus or whatever. They feel justified in doing kind of whatever they want to do. And this woman in the lower right is their daughter, and she grew up in the school too, and ended up through a TikTok video outing them essentially. And now, they're probably going to be serving a lot of time. There's also a bill in the Missouri House that's close to passing that increases regulations of homes like that. Similar situation here, the Cal Farley's Boys Ranch. It's a very well-known institution that's been around in North Texas since the 30s. But until my nonprofit got involved, very few people on the outside knew that they had been severely torturing and abusing and neglecting children for decades. This is a story that we helped to get published in the AP, and it went everywhere. Prior to that, it came out in The Guardian. And when I talked before about survivors, one of the things we can really do for them is to help foster community. And I'm going to show you a video a little bit later in terms of our engagement with this group of survivors. I've been working with them a long time. Some of you may be familiar with this ritual that takes place among the Orthodox Jewish communities. It's genital cutting of male babies in Jewish communities is very common. But in the more conservative ones, they add to the abuse by the moil, the rabbi who's conducting the bris, sucking the wound of the penis with his mouth. And because so many people have herpes simplex 1, there have been babies that have died from this ritual or gotten permanent brain damage because their little bodies can't handle that disease. And one thing that I just wanted to get across that I'll talk about a little bit later is this idea of discriminating against certain children based on the communities they grow up in. And this is just one example where any sexual abuse statute would make it a crime for an adult to do that to a baby. But because it's religiously justified, the rabbis get to to do that to these children. Some ways that I would like to talk about stopping religious child maltreatment. I think some of them are pie in the sky, and some of them are happening now, and some of them hopefully will start happening soon. I think that probably the most important way is to get policies changed so they better protect children instead of protecting religious organizations. And I think it's important to talk about the messaging here, because a lot of times when advocates are trying to say, limit power with the Catholic Church, statutes of limitations and things like that, they approach it from a standpoint of, let's talk about the religious organizations as being really awful and that kind of thing. And that should come out. But I think the main message that's going to have more legs is to look more at this idea of discrimination against certain children. So I mentioned that example. While there are just so many. For example, in Amish communities, they don't have to educate their children after 8th grade. It's in statutes, and the Supreme Court allowed it. To me, that is discrimination against those children who, from no fault of their own, are growing up in an Amish community. It is a crime to deny children education in every state in the country. I think that we shouldn't have these, carved out privileges that discriminate then against children. And I can give you, again, many other examples. I think educating parents on the risk factors of religious authoritarian cultures is really important. A lot of times when parents are in these communities, they aren't aware of how unhealthy they are. Some of them have grown up in them. And so in my book, I included lots of questions that parents can ask themselves to just determine whether or not they're in an unhealthy religious environment. I would love for religious organizations to partner with child advocacy groups and child development experts. Now, some do that. It happens to be the more liberal ones that don't have the serious problems. But this idea of breaking down those separatist boundaries is so important. First of all, when we have seen religious groups trust, say, law enforcement and child protective services, there can be some really great results from that, where cases then get reported. Also, if they partner with child advocacy organizations, they can learn how to develop great child abuse prevention policies, as well as learn about mandatory reporting laws. And then the partnership with child development experts, I think, is something I'd love to see more of, where we could have their materials that are taught in parenting classes and children's programs be vetted so that they can be flagged where there is inappropriate material, teaching a Bible story where, there's just lots of violence to children that are too young to deal with that would be an example. I talked before about giving survivors a voice, and I'm going to now show a video of some survivors of Cal Farley's Boys Ranch, where we help publicize their personal stories and also foster community. That was mostly on Facebook. And we also organized an in-person reunion for survivors in Amarillo, where Cal Farley's Boys Ranch is. And this was the first time a lot of them had either seen each other, for decades, or, just were meeting other survivors for the first time. They ranged in age from having grown up there from the early 1960s until more recently. And so I'll just play this video and hopefully you can hear it okay.
I was beat one time with over 150 licks with a belt by 5 men. That night I was taken to the Vega jail and put in the Vega jail. I spent 2 weeks by myself in the Vega jail, reading a Bible, and letting my bruises and cuts heal before the people at the ranch saw it.
I was sexually assaulted twice while I was out there. The first person that sexually assaulted me, he made me and another person do things together.
My brother was raped when he was 10 years old, but he never told me until a few years, about a year ago. That's been over probably 50 or 60 years he's had this buried in him. And it's awful sad when your brother tells you something like that, and he's had to live with it for all these years.
My father and two uncles spent 10 years at Cal Farley's. And it was something we didn't talk about growing up. I just knew that they were tortured.
My brother passed away a few years ago, but his whole life was nothing but torment. And once I learned from the survivors what really happened to him at Boys Ranch, it became crystal clear to me why he did the things that he did over the years. I could never figure out how my brother, who started out in Catholic school and was an altar boy and a model student, decided that he would shoot dope into his veins every day and be so silent, and we never knew what was going on. One minute he would be okay, and the next minute he would be trying to kill himself.
Cal Farley's ruined my family. My uncle Greg Votaw was a drug addict his whole life. He died behind a dumpster from a heroin overdose. My surviving uncle, bless his heart, he's changed. He did what was done to him, to me and my brothers. So the abuse keeps going. We're all paying. Boys Ranch literally is killing me, because when they did the abuse, or the dining hall restorations, it was asbestos. Everything out there was asbestos, and they didn't remove it properly. And now I have pulmonary fibrosis, asbestosis, and I was told I won't even see my daughter graduate high school.
The other thing that we're interested in doing is to try to be a bridge between survivors and Boys Ranch to see if the institution could use some of its many, many funds to help some of these individuals who have some very desperate needs.
I started a Facebook group called Cal Farley's Boys Ranch Survivors, and it's been going on, I think, about 2.5 years. The first 2 years, it was kind of a secret group, and I think we only had 14 people in it. And after Jason Wilson's article, we let more people in. Right now we got 83 people.
I'm here also to talk for those who can't talk, those who can't do this today, because I'm standing up for them who can't do this, because I believe in what we're doing here is let the public know that I love the boys who I'm here with, and that we do care about our own.
We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to breeze through a few examples of ways that we could try to change policy. This is a bill in California where we wanted to require that clergy report abuse, even if they heard it in confession. Because of the powerful lobby of the Catholic Church, this did not pass, but this is a really important bill for us. And you may be aware that I think it's 20 states now have banned conversion therapy of LGBTQ teens. However, they almost all have exemptions for religious organizations, which are mostly the perpetrators. So that's another issue that we really need to focus on. If anyone is interested in being involved with this issue, please get in touch with us. This is our website, childfriendlyfaith.org. And now I will open it up to questions and see if I can clarify anything for anyone. If anyone wants to share something, I'll just leave it open to you all.
With this, we do have a question that's come through. Why do we hear so much about Christian abuse and so little about Jewish abuse?
Great question. The quick answer is that there are way larger numbers of people of Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's just simply a numbers thing at that point. But I do think that Jewish communities can be very separatist, very protective of anything negative that's going on. They have Jewish laws that prevent people from, say, talking to people outside of their group, saying something negative about a member. So that can be child abuse. That can mean not reporting it. And they can be very secretive. I mean, as secretive as the Catholic Church. But when you have an organization that's as enormous as the Catholic Church, it's hard to kind of contain all of that. And also, in Christian environments, you have all different kinds of levels of authoritarianism. You can have, for example, liberal Christian organizations that are, willing to point the finger at the more conservative ones and showing that there are problems. So there's not that same protectionism. And the last thing I want to just mention is that there are other faiths too that we can't forget about. So for example, in Muslim communities, you still have a lot of that type of secrecy. There have been cases of honor killings and, extreme physical punishment of girls in those communities. So, it does run the gamut.
It sure does. We have another question. Has there been any traction on setting up a national redress scheme to compensate victims in Canada and the US like they've done in places like the UK and Australia? Do you think it would be possible to force religions to participate in these schemes or face serious financial consequences?
I'm not particularly familiar with the types of schemes you're talking about. This has to do with reparations for what kinds of things, like Native people, or maybe more.
I'm not sure. To redress and compensate victims in Canada.
I mean, where I've seen that happen has simply been with class action lawsuits, where you will have a number of survivors that all band together and they'll sue a particular religious organization.
Mm-hmm.
However, I haven't seen much success with those cases. Most of the time, it just happens where one individual is suing, or a criminal case, where certain individuals are brought to court. But I certainly would love to see more religious leaders charged with crimes that they didn't have direct hand in, but they had a secondary hand in by promoting really toxic ideologies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Janet, curious about your thoughts on homeschooling. I think it helps feed the abuse, but many feel it is a parent's right.
Well, parents certainly have a right to make sure that their child is educated. It's more the child's right to education. So, however that's delivered, I don't think that one is worse than the other. The problem with homeschooling is that if it's in a religious authoritarian household or culture, it offers a great cover for abuse and neglect to be going on. So as long as there's regulation, which is certainly lacking, even when it comes to private schools, that's a problem. So, I think it goes back to that idea of we're not going to tolerate discrimination of children, and everyone deserves not just the appearance of an education, but a high quality secular education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it a complicating issue that Jewish law and perhaps JWs also require 2 witnesses to any crime?
Yeah, that is a huge problem in the Jehovah's Witness organization. I've never heard of codifying neglecting child victims' needs in that way, where they unabashedly say a child needs to produce at least 2 witnesses in order for us to, hear the case, and there's no talk of reporting it to the outside. So it sort of adds just another layer of insulation, another justification to ignore those cases. It goes back to what I was saying before about protecting the image of a religious organization. That's the priority, not protecting the rights of the child. So that problem of protecting the collective and not looking at children's individuals' needs is a really big problem in that organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Someone's asking, can you speak about any resources of this type in Canada, or does your Child Friendly Faith Project, do you have an arm in Canada, or?
Well, we are just a very small organization, which is based in Austin because that's just where I lived and started it. But, everything right now seems to be digital and online and reaching out with social media and that kind of a thing. So we don't necessarily see ourselves as being, only communicating with Americans, although we are more familiar with US cases. Probably we're more familiar with Canada than any other country outside the US, just because we don't have the language barrier. You have trafficking of children, and for example, FLDS is over both borders, the northern border, and just because of a similar history, I think that we've seen kind of similar types of Christian-based issues. When you look at abuses against Native children, like in the Catholic Church, that's in both countries really strongly. So, that's we are aware of maybe more cases there, but for the most part, I would say our resources and research has been based in the U.S. But we're always open to expanding that knowledge base. So if you have experiences you want to share or point us to resources in Canada, please do.
I would be very interested in somehow partnering with Child Friendly Faith Project in Canada. So let's you and I talk some more about that and see how I can help, if I can help. We've got some more questions for you.
Okay.
Where, in your opinion, is the line between religious freedom and the right of parents to withhold medicine, to enforce head and face coverings, to mutilate and scar their children, to teach them, to teach from faith-based materials that are creationist, etc.? Where do you see a line there?
I think that is not the conversation that we should be having. I don't think we should be looking for the line. I don't think we should be even looking at religious rights, freedom of speech, or anything like that. I think the focus has to be on children's needs and children's rights, and having that be universal, regardless of the religious beliefs of their caretakers. So how do we define abuse? How do we define neglect? In my book, I'm really clear about that, so that before we start talking about religious, say, physical abuse, we first define what is physical abuse. And if you see that happening in a religious context, it's wrong. It doesn't matter the justification for it. that's never brought out in criminal cases where religion isn't involved. People don't say, well, what was your reason for lighting your child on fire? We don't hear that kind of thing having any weight in criminal cases. It shouldn't either when it comes to being motivated by religious ideology.
And just a reminder, Janet's book is called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. And of course, you can see more about that in our exhibit hall. We have another question. Why did you choose to begin this important work? I so appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you for these questions. They're really amazing. I started this work as a journalist, just being very concerned about the issue. I was tired of seeing, above the fold cases that, were so serious. And I just started collecting more information on it, doing more research until I felt that it needed to be in a book. So that's what I decided to do. So it started with Breaking Their Will.
Wow, this has been so informative and fairly emotional as well. It's such a heavy topic, and you do a great job presenting on it. Thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of children. I just think you're great. So thank you, Janet.
Janice.
This is
Thank you everyone for being part of this talk. I really appreciate it. Please reach out, and thank you again for your great questions.
We'll see you soon, everyone.